Hi everyone. This tutorial is about the next group of macromolecules that we'll be studying, and they're known as lipids. They're also known as fats. So fats is the more common term for this class of macromolecule, but being a biology class, we're going to refer to them as lipids. Lipids are made of three elements. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that was true of the carbohydrates as well, but as you'll see through this tutorial, the arrangement of these three elements is a little bit different in the lipids than in the carbohydrates that we looked at in the last video. Lipids are generally non-polar molecules, and this is related to their structure. They do have polar regions within them, but overall most lipid molecules are non-polar, and this is why we see like oil and water doesn't mix. We all know that. The oil is repelled by the water, and that's because water is polar and the lipid oil is nonpolar. Lipids exhibit a variety of structures, and we'll examine these structures through the rest of the tutorial. Lipids also have a variety of functions. So in the pictures that you see here, we have some butter and a steak. So these contain animal fats, and that's generally, we refer to that as saturated fat. You can see a vessel of oil, probably olive oil. The oils are also a fat, but they are generally unsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats. Candles are made from wax, and waxes are a lipid as well. You can see the duck at the bottom. I chose to put a waterfowl bird on because they produce a natural wax in their feathers that waterproofs their skin so that they can be floating in water all day and not become dehydrated from that. The middle bottom picture, this is a graphic of cell membrane structure. And you may or may not have been aware that our cell membranes and the membranes of our internal organelles in our cells are made from a lipid called phospholipids. And phospholipids have a really interesting structure. We'll be looking at that later in this tutorial. But it's important that you understand what a phospholipid is and why it forms the kind of structure that it does. The last picture, I kind of like this. It's a baseball with a bunch of needles in it, just to indicate steroids. So steroids are lipids, and of course we all know that steroids have been a problem in Major League Baseball. In the last 15-20 years, it's been quite a hot news topic in baseball. So we'll move on. So I want to talk about the basic structure of a triglyceride. Now, a triglyceride, this is a term for the main type of lipids that we have in our bodies. In your textbook, they're referred to as triacylglycerols. That's the exact same thing. I don't want you to be confused, but most people call them triglycerides. The basic structure of a triglyceride, it has two parts to it. One is this glycerol backbone right here. And then it will have three fatty acids attached to that glycerol backbone. And that's why it's called a triglyceride, the tri for the three fatty acids. Glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule, and it has hydrogens around it. And just so you know, there's kind of a shortcut in chemistry where if you don't want to draw in all the hydrogens in a hydrocarbon like this, you just put these lines around the carbons and then don't write the hydrogens in. It's understood that there's a hydrogen there. On this side of the carbon, each of them has a hydroxyl group, one of those functional groups. So an OH. So this is glycerol. And I'll show you in a second how glycerol would attach fatty acids to it. So I want to take a moment and talk about these fatty acids. Fatty acids come in a couple of different forms. There are two main types of fatty acids. There's saturated fats, and secondly, the unsaturated fats. And unsaturated fats can be further subdivided into monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. Monounsaturated fats recently have become quite popular in the media and in the diet world, and so they've kind of given it the short form of MUFAs. So I like to refer to them as MUFAs, and monounsaturated fats are proving to be extremely beneficial to our health. I learned about that back in university 25 years ago, that MUFAs were, according to heart researchers and cardiovascular researchers, MUFAs were proving to be just about the best food that you can eat for cardiovascular health. So it's worth, if you're concerned about health, it's certainly something worth investigating on your own. Okay, so if you look at the diagram below, see if you can see the difference between these two structures. So these are both fatty acids. The top one is a saturated fatty acid, and the bottom one is an unsaturated fatty acid. I want to draw your attention to the red end over here. I don't know if this is going to let me draw on it. Here we go. Okay. So the one end of the fatty acid molecule is a carboxyl group. And if you remember from the previous video, a carboxyl is a C with an O and an OH attached to it. So it's a COOH. So you can see that on the end. It's an important functional group for attaching fatty acids onto that glycerol backbone that you saw in the previous slide. The rest of the fatty acid structure is just a long hydrocarbon chain. Interestingly, the hydrocarbon chain is always an even number of carbons, not odd. The top one is a saturated fat, and you notice that it has all single bonds between the carbon. And we call it saturated because if you think about what the word saturated means, or saturation, it is full with hydrogens. There are no double bonds. Every bond around the carbons is full with a hydrogen. The fatty acid below that is an unsaturated fat, and more specifically, this would be a MUFA. It's a monounsaturated fat because it has one double bond. If it had two double bonds, or three or more, we would then classify it as a polyunsaturated bond. Polyunsaturated fatty acid. But this is an unsaturated fatty acid because it is not full with hydrogens. We can see this double bond right here. And notice what it does to the shape of that hydrocarbon chain when you put a double bond into the molecule. Here's two very similar fatty acids. This is oleic acid and linoleic acid. These are both really important long-chain fatty acids that are essential to our health. They are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. So oleic acid is a monounsaturated fat. So this is a MUFA because it has one double bond. Linoleic acid is a polyunsaturated fatty acid, so I'll call that a PUFA. And I don't think that's an actual term that's used by biochemists, but anyways, we'll start it here. But here's your fatty acid with you can see the carboxyl ends on both of these. Now this is where we're going to get a little more technical. This slide shows you how a glycerol and three fatty acids would form bonds to create a triglyceride. And so here's the glycerol at this end, and then we have our three fatty acids. These three fatty acids are all identical, but usually in a triglyceride they would be different fatty acids. There's the carboxyl group on the end of the fatty acid, and remember we have our hydroxyl group on the glycerol. So what happens is a reaction occurs between the hydrogen right here. Oops, let me move that back. The hydrogen of the hydroxyl group and, no, I'm not going to be able to draw on this, the OH group of the carboxyl. Okay, so if you think back to the last video, what do you get when you put a hydrogen and a hydroxyl together? What does it make? Water. So what type of reaction would this be? Well, it's the same type you saw with carbohydrates. It's called a condensation reaction, which is also known as a dehydration synthesis reaction. Same thing. They mean the same thing. Okay, so it's a condensation reaction. It involves putting the fatty acids on to the glycerol backbone, creating a bond. And we would also make, oh, sorry, let me get out of here. You would also make 3 waters. Okay, along with the triglyceride, you would produce 3 waters. Those waters are removed from putting on the fatty acid with the glycerol. And this type of reaction is called an esterification well, it's a condensation reaction, but if we're talking specifically about lipids, we refer to it as an esterification reaction. And the bond that forms between the glycerol and the fatty acids is called an ester bond. Okay. If you've taken the 4U chemistry course, which I know a few of you have, you've studied the esters in the organic chemistry unit. So triglycerides are a type of ester.